Jack the Ripper is often associated with a series of 11 murders in London between 1888 and 1891, known as the Whitechapel murders. However, only 5 of these murders are definitively linked to Jack the Ripper and are referred to as the canonical Ripper victims. By the late 19th century, Whitechapel in East London was known for severe poverty, overcrowding, and harsh living conditions. The area was densely populated with working-class people, including many immigrants. Whitechapel had a notorious reputation for high crime rates, including theft, assault, and gang activities. Prostitution was prevalent in Whitechapel, largely as a result of the economic desperation of the women living there. The Jack the Ripper murders in 1888 further increased Whitechapel's grim reputation. Mary Ann Nichols. Nichols, as she was often called, Polly. Mary was born on August 26, 1845, in London. In 1864, she married William Nichols, and the couple had 5 children. Mary began drinking heavily, which exacerbated the challenges she faced in her daily life. Her increasing dependence on alcohol was a major factor in the deterioration of her marriage. The strain in her marriage grew as her drinking habits worsened. Her husband, William Nichols, was also unfaithful, which added to the tension between them. Their relationship became increasingly volatile, leading to their eventual separation. In 1880, due to these ongoing issues, Mary and William separated. After the separation, William ceased providing financial support, leaving Mary to fend for herself. This led her to a life of poverty and instability, where she frequently moved between workhouses and resorted to prostitution to survive. August 31, 1888, Mary Ann Nichols was staying at a common lodging house at 18, Thrall Street, Spitalfields. This was a common place for the homeless and destitute to find temporary shelter. However, she didn't have the 4 pence needed to pay for a bed that night. Mary insisted that she would quickly return after earning some money on the streets. She was last seen leaving the lodging house around 1:20 a.m. on August 31, 1888. After leaving the lodging house, Mary was seen by several people as she wandered the streets of Whitechapel. She was likely trying to earn money through prostitution, which was a common means of survival for women in her situation. Witnesses reported that she was visibly intoxicated, but she assured others that she would soon make enough money to pay for her bed. Mary Ann Nichols' body was discovered at approximately 3:40 a.m. by a cart driver named Charles Cross on Bucks Row in Whitechapel. He initially thought she was a sleeping or drunk woman, but upon realizing she was dead, he alerted another passerby, Robert Paul, and together they notified the police. When the police arrived, they found that Mary Ann Nichols had been brutally murdered. Her throat had been slashed twice, and her abdomen had been deeply mutilated. Dr. Rees Ralph Llewellyn, a local surgeon, was called to the scene. He conducted a brief examination of Nichols' body on site and determined that she had been dead for about 30 minutes. The nature of the wounds suggested that the killer had significant knowledge of human anatomy, which led to early speculation that the murderer might have been a doctor or a butcher. Despite the police's efforts, they were unable to identify any strong suspects in the immediate aftermath of Nichols' murder. The lack of witnesses or clear evidence made the investigation challenging. Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman, often referred to as the second canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. Annie was born in September 1840 in Paddington, London. She married John Chapman in 1869, and the couple had 3 children together. In 1882, their daughter, Emily Ruth Chapman, died of meningitis. Both Annie and John now started drinking heavily. The couple eventually separated in 1884, and Annie moved to Whitechapel. After their separation, John provided Annie with a small allowance, but this stopped when he died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1886. Left with no financial support, Annie's life became increasingly unstable. Like many of the Ripper's victims, Annie Chapman turned to casual work and prostitution to survive. She frequently stayed in common lodging houses, particularly at 35 Dorset Street, one of the most notorious areas in Whitechapel. Early September 1888, Annie had a fight with fellow lodger Eliza Cooper and was left with a black eye and bruising to the chest. September 7, 1888, Annie Chapman's last days were spent bruised and in pain, her health rapidly failing. September 8, 1888, 1:45 a.m., she had no money to pay for her bed for that night. She left the lodging house around 1:45 a.m. on September 8, stating that she would go out to try and earn the money. September 8, 1888, 5:30 a.m. Several witnesses reported seeing Annie in the early hours of September 8. At approximately 5:30 a.m., she was seen talking to a man outside 29 Hanbury Street, a location not far from her lodging house. At around 6 a.m., her body was discovered by John Davis, a resident of 29 Hanbury Street, in the backyard of the property. He immediately alerted the police. Annie Chapman had been brutally murdered. Her throat was deeply slashed, and her abdomen had been cut open, with some of her internal organs removed and placed beside her body. The post-mortem was conducted by Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon. He confirmed that the injuries were consistent with those seen in the previous murder of Mary and Nichols, suggesting that the same person was responsible for both crimes. He also noted that the killer had removed parts of Annie's uterus, indicating a level of anatomical knowledge. Annie Chapman's murder deepened the panic in Whitechapel. The brutality of the crime and the apparent lack of progress in the police investigation fueled fears that a dangerous and highly skilled killer was on the loose. The press coverage of Annie Chapman's murder was extensive, with newspapers publishing graphic details of the crime. The Dear Boss letter. The Dear Boss letter is one of the most famous and significant pieces of evidence associated with the Jack the Ripper case. It was the first letter signed by a Jack the Ripper, a name that has since become synonymous with the unidentified serial killer responsible for the brutal murders. Up until that point, the killer had been known variously as the Red Fiend, the Whitechapel Murderer, and Leather Apron. The letter was dated September 25, 1888, but it was received by the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888. The letter was addressed to the boss at the Central News Agency, a prominent news organization in London at the time. Dear Boss. I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. The next job I do, I shall clip the lattice ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it, no luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. The letter was forwarded to Scotland Yard, and although initially considered a hoax, its mention of clipping the lady's ears off became chillingly relevant. When Catherine Eddowes was found murdered on September 30, 1888, with part of her ear cut off. The Dear Boss letter was first made public on October 1, 1888. After the double murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on September 30, 1888. Elizabeth Stride. She was also known as Long Liz due to her tall stature. Elizabeth was born on November 27, 1843, in Sweden. Stride moved to London in 1866. She married John Thomas Stride, a ship's carpenter, in 1869. The couple eventually separated in 1881, after which Elizabeth struggled with her finances and frequently stayed in common lodging houses. She worked as a domestic servant before turning to prostitution, likely due to financial difficulties. Elizabeth Stride was seen several times on the evening of September 29 and the early hours of September 30. Witnesses reported seeing her with different men in the hours leading up to her death. At approximately 12:45 a.m. on September 30th, Stride was seen by a laborer named William Marshall, who described her as talking to a man outside of 64, Burner Street. She was later seen with another man, described by Israel Schwartz, who witnessed an altercation between the man and Stride. Schwartz's account is significant because he saw a man physically assault Stride, possibly throwing her to the ground. However, it's unclear whether this man was her killer. Stride's body was discovered at 1 a.m. by Louis Deemschutz, a local club steward, in Dutfield's yard, off Burner Street. He lived with his wife in rooms above the club and had just returned from selling jewelry at a market that night. As he drove into the yard, his pony suddenly shied away, and Deemschutz sensed something was in the way. In the dim light, he initially thought it might be a bundle of rags or some other obstruction. He got down from the cart and used the handle of his whip to prod the object, only to realize it was a woman lying on the ground. He immediately entered the club and said to the club members, "There's a woman lying in the yard, but I cannot say whether she is drunk or dead." Deemschutz returned to the yard with several club members. They now noticed blood near the body, and when those present saw that the woman's throat had been cut, they ran to find the police. However, when help arrived, it was clear that the woman, Elizabeth Stride, was already dead. She was found lying on her side with her throat deeply slashed, but with no further mutilations to her body, which was unusual compared to the other Ripper victims. Unlike the other Ripper victims, Stride's body was not mutilated, which has led to speculation that the killer may have been interrupted before he could continue. Linked to the double event, Stride's murder is often connected to the murder of Catherine Eddowes, which occurred about 45 minutes later in Mitre Square. Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes was one of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, and her murder is considered one of the most brutal in the series of killings. Her death, which occurred on the same night as Elizabeth Stride's, is part of what is known as the double event. Eddowes was born on April 14, 1842, in Wolverhampton, England. Eddowes grew up in a large family in Wolverhampton. She later moved to London, where she worked in various jobs, including as a domestic servant and a tin plate worker. Eddowes had a long-term relationship with Thomas Conway, with whom she had 3 children. After her relationship with Conway ended, she became involved with John Kelly, with whom she lived in Whitechapel. Eddowes struggled with alcoholism, which contributed to her impoverished circumstances. Like many of the other Ripper victims, she often stayed in common lodging houses. On September 29, 1888 in the evening, Eddowes had been drinking heavily and was found lying drunk on the pavement in Aldgate High Street. She was taken into custody by the police at Bishopsgate Police Station at approximately 8:30 p.m. Eddowes was held in a cell to sober up and was released at around 1 a.m. on September 30th. Upon her release, she gave a false name, Mary Ann Kelly. Less than an hour after her release, at around 1:45 a.m., Eddowes's body was discovered by Police Constable Edward Watkins in Mitre Square, a dark and quiet square in the City of London. Her body was found lying on her back with extensive mutilations, including facial and abdominal mutilations. The Ripper had removed her uterus and left kidney, and her face had been severely disfigured. Like the other victims, Eddowes died from a deep cut to the throat, which severed the carotid artery and windpipe. Eddowes's face was horribly mutilated, with her nose and parts of her ears and eyelids cut off, her abdomen was slashed open, and several organs, including her left kidney and part of her uterus, were removed and taken by the killer. The double event, Eddowes's murder, occurred less than an hour after the murder of Elizabeth Stride, leading to the theory that Jack the Ripper killed twice in one night. The fact that Eddowes was murdered shortly after Stride, and in a different location, has been seen as evidence that the Ripper was interrupted while killing Stride and then sought out another victim. A piece of Catherine Eddowes's bloodied apron was found in Golston Street, several streets away from the crime scene. Near the apron was a piece of graffiti that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The significance of this message has been widely debated, but it has led some to speculate about the identity or intentions of the Ripper. The Saucy Jackie postcard. The Saucy Jackie A postcard is one of the most famous pieces of correspondence associated with the Jack the Ripper case. The postcard was postmarked and received on October 1, 1888. The day after the double event, when both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were murdered. The postcard was addressed to the Central News Agency, the same organization that received the Dear Boss letter. It was written in a taunting, casual tone and made reference to the two murders that had occurred just the night before. I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. The postcard was postmarked before details of the double event were widely known to the public, leading some to believe that it was genuinely sent by the killer. Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly was born in 1863 in Ireland. Later, she is said to have lived in Cardiff and then in London. Kelly worked as a prostitute, which was common among the women who lived in the impoverished Whitechapel area. She was known for her good looks and was sometimes called Ginger because of her red hair. Friends described her as a kind and attractive woman, though she struggled with alcoholism. Kelly was living in a small, single-roomed flat at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street in Spitalfields, London. This was a step up from the common lodging houses frequented by many of the other victims. She met Joseph Barnett and, thereafter, they lived together for about 18 months in various locations, eventually settling in Miller's Court, where Kelly was later murdered. October 30, 1888, Barnett left Kelly, mainly due to Barnett's disapproval of Kelly's continued involvement in prostitution. On the night of November 8, 1888, Kelly was seen in the company of a man by several witnesses. One of the last sightings was around 2 a.m. on November 9, when a neighbor heard her singing in her room. The last confirmed sighting was around 4 a.m. when a neighbor, Elizabeth Prater, reported hearing a faint cry of a murder coming from Kelly's room. This was not unusual in Whitechapel, so it was not immediately alarming. Mary Kelly's mutilated body was discovered at around 10:45 a.m. on November 9, 1888, by Thomas Bowyer, the assistant of her landlord, John McCarthy. Bowyer had been sent to collect overdue rent. When he found the door locked, he looked through a broken window pane and saw the horrific scene inside. Her body was lying on the bed, and the level of mutilation was far more extreme than that seen in any of the other Ripper victims. Like the other victims, Kelly's throat was cut, almost decapitating her. However, the extensive mutilations that followed were unprecedented. Kelly's face was hacked beyond recognition, and her chest, abdomen, and thighs had been cut open. Many of her organs were removed and placed around the room, and her heart was missing. The gruesome nature of the crime suggested that the killer had spent a considerable amount of time in the room, taking advantage of the privacy that Kelly's single-room occupancy provided. The From Hell letter. Letter received, October 16, 1888. The From Hell letter was sent to George Lusk. George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local citizens who were working to assist the police in capturing the Ripper. Accompanying the letter was a small box containing what was later identified as half of a human kidney. The letter claimed that the sender had removed the kidney from one of his victims, and that he had eaten the other half. Given that Catherine Eddowes, one of the Ripper's victims, had her left kidney removed during her murder, the letter and its accompanying package were particularly chilling. From Hell. Mr. Lusk. Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you, tother piece I fried and ate it was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed. Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. The authenticity of the From Hell letter is hotly debated. Some believe it was truly sent by Jack the Ripper, while others argue it was a prank by a medical student with access to human organs. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9, 1888, the killing ceased. Despite the police's extensive efforts and numerous suspects, Jack the Ripper was never caught. The question of why Jack the Ripper stopped his killing spree remains one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the case. His elusiveness and the gruesome nature of his crimes have made him a lasting figure, both as a historical enigma and a symbol of fear and evil. After hearing about the murders, what do you think was the most chilling aspect of the case? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's discuss in the comments. Thanks for watching.